So welcome everybody. My name is Matt Bach. I'm the director of the endurance business at UCAN. And I also happen to be your case study for the evening. So you'll hear more about my background in a little bit. But I'm honored to have the great Bob Seebohar with us tonight. Bob is the Olympic dietitian for the US triathlon team in Beijing. He's a registered sports dietitian, an endurance coach, an accomplished athlete himself. And I love working with Bob because he just has such a great head on his shoulders. He's a very accomplished sports dietitian out in the space and just really does a good job of, he knows the science, but he's able to speak really, really well and bring it down to terms that us regular people can understand too. So welcome, Bob.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's an honor to be chatting with everybody tonight.
So to give everybody an idea of what to expect, I'm going to ask Bob questions and Bob will present. We'll go back and forth a bit on this topic that we're talking about tonight, which is metabolic efficiency, eating for better health and performance. And Bob is going to present a number of interesting slides, and then I'm going to serve myself up as a case study of how big an impact nutrition can make. And I'd like first to get a feel for the audience, the live audience that we have here. So if each of you could type into the Zoom chat, if you could let us know, are you a runner? Are you a triathlete? And then maybe on like a scale of 1 to 10, with a 10 being a pro triathlete or a pro runner, and a 0 being like you've coming off the couch and you've never done running before. Like, where do you lie on that spectrum of kind of that beginner to elite? It'd be really helpful for us to know what the audience is here. I'll give everybody a couple moments to do that. And while you're doing that, we'll recap it in a second after people have had a chance to respond. But in the meantime, then I'm going to flip it over to Bob so that we can hear a little bit more about Bob's background. And as I mentioned, just a couple of his accolades, but there's plenty more on this slide here. So Bob, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it. I won't be too long-winded because obviously everybody can read. I just want to highlight a few things. I am a registered sport dietitian, as Matt mentioned. I'm also a physiologist, also one of the very few USAT level 3 elite coaches. I've been doing this for over 25 years, coaching athletes, providing nutrition plans, doing physiology testing. So as Matt said, I like to keep my finger on the pulse of the research, but I love taking the research and putting it into real life and making it just come to life. I mean, I know that sounds funny, but a lot of times we read research or we read articles and we can't really understand it. So one of my specialties is kind of bringing that home and really giving you good nutrition concepts and good nutrition strategies to be able to utilize. So you can read a little bit more about me. I've been around the block. I'm currently in Colorado. I own my own business, Energy Performance. Have been on my own for about 13 years without a steady paycheck, I like to say. But I provide all sorts of nutrition coaching, physiological and biomarker testing, and endurance coaching for mostly focus on endurance athletes, although I do nutrition coaching with quite a few individuals outside of endurance also. That's the quick and dirty about Bob.
Go on for days with all the things you've accomplished.
Yeah, I could. No,
that was great. So let's kick it over here. I mean, one of the main things that I'm really interested in on this topic on metabolic efficiency is, where did it all come from? I mean, how did you come up with this concept? I mean, this, so everybody knows, this is a concept that you've coined. So metabolic efficiency training is your brainchild. And where did this come from? Why did you start this?
Yeah, it's a great. I love sharing this story. Now, again, I could be completely long-winded, but I'm not going to be. I'm going to kind of cut to the point here and cut to the chase. Early 2000s, I found that there was a lot of discrepancy. I was actually an endurance athlete. I actually started as an endurance athlete in 1998, not to date myself too much. Actually, 1995, I started running some 5Ks and 10Ks. 1998, I started getting a little more serious into triathlon. And I just found that, I was experiencing a huge amount of GI distress. And those are back in the days where everyone was just saying, eat as many carbohydrates as possible, have, the sport drinks, we didn't have gummies or chews back then, but have the bars, have everything, have the gels, just eat as much as you can. GI distress is kind of the rite of passage, if you will. And I didn't really like that. I mean, from an athlete perspective, it didn't feel good, obviously, having all these GI distress symptoms and problems. But as a sport dietitian, I thought there would be a better way. So basically, fast forward, it was mid-2000s. I just started looking at all the research I could. I went back to all the research I did in grad school and just looked at everything possible. And I found that There was actually some really good research regarding blood sugar control, the optimization of blood sugar, how nutrients, how the macros, carbohydrate, protein, and fat affect blood sugar. And more importantly, if you actually support and optimize blood sugar, you can actually get rid of that, what I call GI distressed monster. So I started coming up with, and it's all research based, and you can see in front of you the graphic that I use to explain metabolic efficiency training. Metabolic efficiency training is a series of daily and training nutrition interventions or strategies, if you will. They're not diets, right? It's actually not a diet at all. Metabolic efficiency training is a lifestyle periodized approach. So 75% of your ability to teach your body to utilize more fat as energy, preserve carbohydrates, and get rid of the GI distress monster is attributed to nutrition. 25% is attributed to exercise, specifically aerobic exercise, because that's the type of activity and exercise that really improves our fat oxidation in our mitochondria. But it's a very small portion when it comes to exercise. So I blew up this nutrition piece, and I've really come up with this great nutrition strategy. Actually, there's a few nutrition strategies that you can implement. As you can see from this graph on the screen, I kind of refer to this as a bell-shaped curve, right? In the middle is where almost all of us should sit, and that's metabolic efficiency training. You're going to need different amounts of carbohydrate, protein, and fat throughout the year based on your health, your fitness, and your performance goals. We realize that. What we don't really do and don't support too much anymore is the far left, which is that low carb, high fat keto, or the far right, which is the high carb, low fat. Those are very either restrictive or not restrictive. They're somewhat eliminating, and they do not satisfy part of the lifestyle continuum. So metabolic efficiency training allows you to go within that bell-shaped curve, allows you to say, listen, it's COVID, right? I'm not training a lot. I'm not competing at all. That allows you to manipulate or periodize, if you will, your macronutrients, your carbohydrate, protein, and fat. And when we all get back to racing and competing again and training at a little bit more volume or intensity, we can periodize our nutrients to support that. So metabolic efficiency training is all about periodizing your nutrients, your carb, protein, and fat to support blood sugar, but also to optimize blood sugar. And you'll hear that story as we go along here. Did that help explain that a little bit, Matt?
Yeah, that's perfect. And exactly what I was looking for. And I love this chart. I don't think I had actually seen this one before until maybe this past week as we were preparing these slides, but this is great. I really love how it puts it into context. Right here in this one slide, you can see, keto has become such a huge thing. And I know lots and lots of people who have jumped on this keto idea, and it puts into perspective and shows that it's a more extreme measure than something like metabolic efficiency training, which is quite balanced. And there's that periodization that you mentioned, and then on the other end of the spectrum is that high carb methodology of eating that has been kind of touted as the way to do it for a long time with the carb loading and pasta dinners and all that stuff.
Right.
So on the next slide. So why metabolic efficiency training? You mentioned a couple of reasons why, like the GI distress, but what are some of the other reasons why people would want to follow this, and what could it do for people?
Yeah. So way back when I started developing this concept, it was all about getting rid of GI distress for myself, for the athletes I was working with. I was just like, I had it. I threw my hands up in the air. All the athletes I was working with, we were just sick of it, right? But as I got along a little bit more into the years and did a little bit more of the research and actually looked at more of the research, I started to find that there were some really significant ancillary benefits to metabolic efficiency training, AKA optimizing blood sugar. So yes, gets rid of the GI distress monster. But here's what we know also, which we'll talk about here in a second, but our body has certain stores of carbohydrate and fat. We can actually teach the body through nutrition, through what you put in your body for food, for sustenance. You can actually teach it to favor either carbohydrate or sugar burning, if you will, or fat burning. So you could go either way in a non-disease state, right? But we can actually, the whole point of metabolic efficiency training is to manipulate your body so you actually encourage it to utilize more of its internal fat stores as energy, and you preserve the carbohydrate stores. So that's point number 2. Point number 3 is, I think what everybody athlete is looking for, in addition to maybe faster times or better competing or better recovery, is how do we change our body weight and our body composition? So through the optimization and even control of blood sugar, if we can control blood sugar, we can control some hormonal responses in the body that will affect positive or negative body weight composition or body weight changes and body composition changes. So that's number 3. We can actually have a robust effect on body weight and body composition. Obviously, it improves, actually, maybe not obviously, maybe it's not obviously, but we can improve health markers and risk of chronic diseases. So blood sugar is tied to a lot of metabolic disorders. A lot of metabolic disorders such as diabetes, prediabetes. There's a lot of blood lipid, high cholesterol, high triglycerides. A lot of things are centered actually on the regulation of blood sugar. So if we go up and down with our blood sugar all throughout the day, we're actually going to possibly predispose ourselves, of course, depending on your genetic history, your medical health history, on having more metabolic disorders. So this will actually improve these health markers. And lastly, as a registered dietitian, I would be very unjustified not to mention the relationship with food that we have. And I know that sounds kind of touchy-feely, hunky-dory, but we want to develop this healthy relationship with food. Remember the slide that we showed last time? If we follow the extremes, so like the low carb, high fat, or in keto, or the high carb, low fat, those are extremes. And that doesn't necessarily develop a healthy relationship with food because you're always thinking, I can't, or I shouldn't, or I won't, right? And to be honest with you, as a dietitian, that's not what I want to teach. I want to teach somewhere in the middle where nothing is eliminated unless you have a food intolerance or a food allergy, obviously. But we want to live with food. We want to encourage our body to accept different foods at different times without going overboard, but more importantly, being comfortable with the food that we eat and that we choose to eat. So those are the 5 main reasons of the why behind metabolic efficiency training.
That's really refreshing to hear, because so many of the things that you hear about, it's very restrictive, and it's very much like, you know, you need to be on point all the time, and there's no misses, which is you know, one of the ways that you coin these you know, I hate to use the word cheats, but these things where you can indulge in something like a glass of wine or a piece of cake, or you know, something that people normally wouldn't think of as being a healthy thing that you should be eating as part of this diet. And that's the whole point, is like, this isn't a diet, it's a lifestyle thing. And the other big takeaway here is that this is really eye-opening, because what you're talking about is so much of like a balanced approach and a very sustainable approach, very lifestyle approach that really, I mean, everybody should be following something, not everybody, a lot of people should be following something like this, because it's going to encourage better health and better body composition in the long term. Would you say that most of America then is probably more towards that high carb end of the spectrum, and is probably why we have so many health problems in America?
Yes, and I would say it's starting to change, kind of that low carb, high fat, or the keto, but absolutely what's dominated the US society probably for the past, 20, 30, 40 years is definitely the high carb, low fat. I mean, it's what I was taught in university with my undergrad, my 2 graduate degrees. I mean, it was just throwing down high carb, low fat, food pyramid, everything. So it did. And there's actually some great research that's been done and come out on kind of looking at saturated fats differently, looking at simple sugars differently, and really the culprit being that we are completely imbalanced in our macronutrients, but simply consuming too many simple sugars, too many processed refined carbohydrates.
They're so easy to find. They're everywhere.
Totally.
So just to circle back quickly, people did respond to me about what it is they are, a runner, a triathlete, what level, beginner, or whatever. So it looks like we've got a mix. We've got some fairly beginner-esque people in that like 2 to 5 range, and then we have some that are in the 5 to 8 range, so more on the experienced end of things. And looks like we've got some triathletes. Of the people that responded, we have slightly more triathletes, and we have some runners. Looks like Karen apparently has run 63 marathons and 173 half marathons. That's a lot.
Man, that is a lot.
Thanks for responding on that. And one of the other things, when I mentioned what to expect with this, one of the other things to expect is that at the end, you'll have a chance to ask any and all questions that you have for me or Bob. So ask your questions at any time. Because we have a relatively smaller live group, we can answer questions as we go through this presentation, but we'll also have time at the end to answer your questions. So feel free to put them into the chat at any time, and we'll address them when it seems most appropriate. So I'm going to move on to the next slide here.
Okay.
And this is over to you again, Bob. I love this slide.
Yeah, so I hinted on this a little bit earlier on our body storing different types of nutrients. So our body predominantly stores carbohydrate and fat. We don't store protein as protein. Amino acids protein is denatured. Amino acids kind of float around. We use them as we need them. we really talk about fat and carbohydrates. So as you can see from the graphic up here, most of us recreational, just commoners, competitive, but just commoners, not elite professional, we store at least 80,000 or more calories in our body as fat. Now, if you start doing the math, like and I know a lot of it depends here, but like a typical Ironman, you'll burn about, give or take, 8 to 10,000 calories in an Ironman. So just to put that in context, right? You have enough fat stores in your body to run about 8 to 10 Ironman races, which is crazy to think about. In contrast, we only store up to 2,000 calories worth of carbohydrate. So, and that actually depends on how big you are and your gender. Smaller petite females store less carbohydrate because the predominant amount is stored in our muscle, and small females just have less muscle. Large males will store a little bit more. I saw this, 15, 16 years ago. I revisited this from Exercise Physiology 101, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, is there an opportunity, if we store that much fat, is there an opportunity to actually tap in to those stores so we can actually use them? And that was kind of the birthing moment of metabolic efficiency training, where I actually explored and answered the question, can we use our enormous amount, almost unlimited stores of fat? Can we use that for energy? And yes, we can, through dietary manipulations, basically looking at carbohydrate, protein, and fat with the goal of optimizing blood sugar. So great opportunity to use a little bit of physiology and biochemistry and kind of bring it to life through nutrition, which I think is where we're going next.
Yeah, let's do it.
So that said, there are to date, so this is it's probably 16 years now, 16 or 17 years since I first developed and really trademarked the metabolic efficiency concept, and also nutrition periodization, which you see here. And I didn't talk too much about that, but let me just briefly speak about that. Nutrition periodization means that you eat according to your training needs. So according to your training cycle. And again, this has been a really weird year, but if it's a traditional year, most people are pretty much in competitive cycle right now. You would be racing, you'd be competing maybe a couple times a month, depending, or maybe you're getting ready for fall races. So that would require a little bit different food intake from your carbohydrate, protein, and fat than would like an off season or a pre-competition or a base training, right? So nutrition periodization, basically you are eating to support your training. So that said, we always want to respect that nutrition periodization first. But in the past, 16, 17 years, I've actually identified 5 different nutrition strategies that you can implement to improve your body's ability to burn more fat, essentially, or become more metabolically efficient. So the first 3 are what I predominantly use. So the first one, just to quickly explain this, the carbohydrate to protein ratio, a lot of research to support this. I actually looked at research in people with diabetes when I was first developing this, and obviously people with diabetes need to regulate their blood sugar like crazy. Otherwise, obviously some bad things happen to them. So what I learned was that if we can actually assimilate carbohydrates and protein in roughly the same amounts, we can optimize blood sugar the best you can ever think about. And this is how I teach it, is not getting quantitative. So I can be as quantitative as the next person. In fact, I did that quite a bit when I first got out of school, my internship way long time ago. And I found a lot of the athletes I was working with didn't really understand the numbers. They wanted it in terms of food. So I actually developed this hand model, I call it. So here's how I teach it. One hand, so your wrist all the way to your fingertips, your entire hand, that's one hand of carbohydrates. The other hand is protein. Where does fat fall in? Well, fat is incorporated into animal-based protein sources. So if you're a vegan or vegetarian, please ask the questions. We can have a conversation, but here's what I'm saying. If you are not a vegan or vegetarian, you eat animal-based protein sources, most likely you're going to get enough fat in your daily nutrition plan, because if you eat a steak, if you eat full-fat yogurt, if you eat cottage cheese or eggs, all of those foods have fat. So we really talk about carbohydrate to protein ratio to manipulate your blood sugar during your meals. And this is daily nutrition. So a one hand of carbs to one hand of protein, that is ideal for optimizing blood sugar. That will help everything that we've been talking about so far. Now, what I also found in the research was based on your training, right? If you're training a little bit more, you actually need a little bit more carbohydrate in your daily nutrition plan. So you can do 2 hands of carbohydrate to 1 hand of protein. And that is still good regulation of blood sugar. It's not until you get into the 3 hands or 4 hands or greater of carbohydrate to 1 hand protein, that starts not miscommunicating, but misregulating your blood sugar, and it actually spikes your blood sugar. Whenever you spike your blood sugar, you're actually going to increase the insulin response from your pancreas. That actually disrupts your body's ability to burn fat. So whenever insulin swoops in to get blood sugar lower, which is what it's made to do, one of the things it's made to do, it also kind of has a side job of significantly reducing fat metabolism or fat burning, which means that stores fat. It doesn't burn fat. So the hand model is the easiest. 1-to-1 or two hands of carbs to 1, easiest you'll ever learn, right? The other thing is periodization plates. So you can actually look on your plate when you eat it, and you can kind of actually use the hand model to do this. But roughly speaking, depending on the periodization cycle or training cycle that you're in, roughly speaking, you want, literally, if we're following the 1-to-1, you want half your plate as a carbohydrate. So that's either vegetables or fruits or whole grains, not processed refined starchy foods, but whole grains. And then 1 hand of protein. So that's the easiest way to do it. Or you can, if you're doing 2 hands of carbohydrate, you basically say 1/4 of your plate is protein and 3/4, or roughly speaking, is your carbohydrate-based food. So periodization plates is super easy because you don't have to count anything. You just look at your plate and you put the food around it, right? Or on it to manipulate the portions or the ratio that you want. The third one is actually super popular when I work with my endurance athletes or my carbohydrate junkies. I'll call, and I used to be there, self-professed. I used to be there. In fact, that's probably why I had a lot of GI distress in the past. But carbohydrate unloading means this. Carnivores, exactly, right? Sugar monsters. Carbohydrate unloading basically says over a 4-week period of time, if you come from being a carbivore, sugar monster, whatever, you're going to need to unload before you make significant dietary changes. Otherwise, you will be unsuccessful. I guarantee it 99.9% of the time, right? You cannot pull the trigger, switch on the light or switch off the light that quickly with nutrition. Now, like with training, you can say, hey, guess what? Tomorrow's a rest day and you'll take a rest. But you can't work that, like the body doesn't work that fast with nutrition. So this carbohydrate unloading might be, hey, instead of eating 2 bagels for breakfast, next week I'm going to eat 1 bagel for breakfast. And then the next week, maybe you eat a half a bagel, or maybe you switch the bagel to some berries or some other type of fruit. So you just want to every
It's not
week,
like jumping in cold water.
It's not like jumping in cold water. Absolutely. You kind of want to ease into it, right? So every week you just unload until you find your sweet spot where you are really regulating your blood sugar better. And we'll jump into that in the next couple slides. I'm not going to talk too much about this low carb, high fat. It's very strategic. I help athletes do that mostly because athletes don't know how to do that. It is, I don't want to say it's dangerous. It's very tricky to do when you're an endurance athlete in a heavy training cycle. So I don't condone it. I would want you to have the support of someone that knows what they're doing to help you through that process. Otherwise, it's a failure waiting to happen. And then the fat adaptation carbohydrate restoration strategy, that is the best example I can give there. If you guys follow Tour de France or Chris Froome, obviously not this year, but in the past, his team has actually followed different periodization cycles to where they will actually change their team's nutrition plan to incorporate a higher fat, lower carb dietary plan in their base training phase, right? So they get all these mitochondrial benefits, but then once the thermostat turns up, if you will, volume goes up, intensity goes up a little bit, then they start restoring their carbohydrates so they have energy to sustain themselves. So I usually don't recommend 5 too often because it's really, really tricky. It's even trickier than the whole strategic low carb, high fat. So most of the time I am dealing with number 1, number 2, or number 3. As you saw, most of them are very qualitative. Do you need to count calories? No, absolutely not. Not during daily nutrition, right? Absolutely not. Do you need to count grams? No. Can you? Certainly you can, but I don't want to get into that conversation of telling you that what you see on the label sometimes is actually not what is in the product. I think most of you know that, but a lot of supplement companies specifically have a lot of wiggle room in terms of what they report on the label. So top 3, carbohydrate to protein ratio with a hand model, periodization plates, look at food on your plate. And then if you are that carbivore, unloading for 4 weeks to stabilize your blood sugar to a spot where now you can actually work with it a little bit.
Now, you're all West Coast, so it's about 6 o'clock your time
Mm,
right now, and dinner is coming up. So when you have your dinner in front of you tonight, you can hold your hands up and you can check to
exactly.
see how you're doing.
Yep.
Maybe increase the
Yep.
protein content a little bit
Yes.
relative to the carb content this tonight. So we've got a question from Michael. He's asking, are you saying the serving size is the size of your hands or roughly that size?
Correct. So here's actually, let me qualify this because I actually just talked to an athlete today about this. The ratio is what is the most important. So the ratio of this 1-to-1. So for example, a dinner is not a good example, but maybe you had a snack today and you're like, oh my gosh, this guy is telling me to eat a whole handful of carbs and a whole handful of protein, and it's a snack, right? No, 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 no. The ratio is what's important. So say tonight, maybe you're on the East Coast, you're on Matt's time, and you're like, man, I want a snack, but I don't want a meal. Have a half a hand of carbohydrate and half a hand of protein. So I wouldn't say the serving size necessarily. I would say the ratio. So personally, I like to start, if you're going to have a traditional breakfast, lunch, or dinner, I do like to start at the hands because usually we need a little bit more sustenance during those times. But if you're a grazer throughout the day, start with half a hand and half a hand. And then if you're still hungry, add a little bit more, but in the same ratio, in that same 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 if you're going to follow a 2-to-1.
Excellent. Now, on the UCAN side, I work for UCAN. I'm the director of our endurance business, and you recommend UCAN, and you've done that for years, ever since I think
Yeah.
even before the company was a company.
Yep.
Now, what is it, and why do you recommend it? Where does it all fit in?
Yeah, it's funny. Do you want kind of the story?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, so this dates back to 2006. I always kid because one of the founders, Peter, I say he was stalking me. He wasn't stalking me, but he had gotten a hold of me, and I was in a position, and this happens quite often where companies will call me and say, hey, I've got the next best thing. I want you to look at it. I want you to endorse or whatever. And I'm like, okay, well, whatever. My response usually is, all right, Peter, here, and this is what I told him almost verbatim. I said, listen, from what you're saying, if there's truth to it, I think you've got something. And again, as Matt said, this is before UCAN ever existed, right? As really a sport nutrition company. I said, if you can show me research that supports the claims you are making, this will completely revolutionize the sport nutrition industry and will change the way I work with athletes. And I just left it at that, because whenever I usually say that to people, I never hear from them again. So it was about, I don't know what it was. I think it was about a year and a half later, I get this call. It's Peter. He's like, hey, can I send you, what's your email? Can I send you some research? And I was shocked. Like, that never happens. But when he sent me the preliminary research, I was shocked also. So I saw that preliminary research and I said, listen, you've got something. You should absolutely, because at this point they were wondering if they should actually bridge into the sport nutrition market. And I said, absolutely 100%. But here's the thing. Nobody's going to believe you unless you have research, right? Because this is way different than what we were taught, which is basically shove as many simple sugars in your mouth as possible, right? So I was excited because he showed me the science. The science continued to evolve. And I have been a believer in UCAN literally since probably 2006, 2007. I mean, that's how long I have been kind of on the UCAN support train, if you will. And I use it with almost every athlete that I encounter, including myself.
Yeah, I love that story. It almost gives me chills just
Yeah,
thinking about it
I know.
because of the
Gives me chills
early
too.
early history. But let's take a quick step back though. For anybody in the audience who is unfamiliar with what UCAN is, um, what is it? And and then I'll describe. Maybe I'll tell the Jonah story after that and tell everybody where it
Yeah.
came from.
So UCAN is actually, so it's a non-GMO cornstarch, right? That is manipulated through cooking, really, which changes the molecular structure of it to enhance its ability to, number one, empty the stomach extremely quickly. It has what's called a high molecular weight, so it gets out of the stomach really fast, which for all us endurance athletes, that's kind of important when we're training and when we're exercising, because we don't want something sitting in our stomach like a ton of bricks or just slogging around there. So it empties the stomach extremely fast, and it actually absorbs in the small intestine very slow. So it's kind of that slower burning energy that you're going to have throughout a series or throughout a time where the dosing doesn't have to be as aggressive as what we're used to with simple sugars. So as an example, and super starch is the main, what we're talking about is the super starch, which is the patented ingredient really in almost all of UCAN's products. So as a quick example, instead of having your gels or your gummies or your simple sugar sport drinks every 15 to 20 minutes, which is what we normally do, maybe every 30 minutes, I usually end up dosing UCAN for athletes every 60 to 90 minutes. I mean, that's how long and slow the burn is. And it's steady energy. So you don't get that rush and then that drop. You don't get that up and down with the blood sugar kind of thing. It's very steady. And I'll tell you, I mean, I've had some of the best races ever when I'm taking UCAN, and so have my athletes. And I know, Matt, you'll come in with your case study, but it's a patented starch, which is it's called the super starch, that is just cooked. Like, there's no chemicals in it. It's basically just cooked non-GMO cornstarch.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue. I think I'm actually going to jump ahead to this slide here because the story of UCAN began with Jonah. And this was back in 2001. Jonah Feldman was born, and he has a rare metabolic disorder called glycogen storage disease. So as you can see, it began with Jonah with a medical disorder. It had nothing to do with endurance sports. And that's what Bob was alluding to before when he said that Peter, our co-founder and our current acting vice president, came to Bob and said, you know, this is what we have. Is this interesting to you as an endurance athlete? The reason why he was asking this of Bob is because he didn't know if this would be interesting to endurance athletes. He only knew that it had applications for these kids like Jonah with this rare metabolic disorder. So Jonah was actually the inspiration for our company. In 2001, he was born with this disease. And what it means for him is he can't process glycogen the same way that we can to create blood glucose and keep his blood sugar levels stable in his body. So he needs to be fed every 2 to 3 hours or so Argo cornstarch from the grocery store just to keep him alive. And that includes through the night. And his parents would be waking up multiple times through the night, feeding him through his feeding tube. Everybody is sleep deprived. Nobody's getting, you know, living normal lives. And it was very, very disruptive to the family. But they were able to keep him alive. So they were happy with that at first. But then they said, there's got to be some better way to do this. And ultimately in 2008, so they put together a foundation to try to fund research in order to find either a cure or a better way to manage glycogen storage disease. And what ultimately happened was in 2008, a team of Scottish researchers discovered this process, this cooking process that Bob was mentioning, how they take non-GMO cornstarch and they were able to cook it and elongate the molecule to epic proportions using this cooking technology that they had discovered. And it created superstarch. And this superstarch is like no other carbohydrate on the planet because Jonah was unable to take any other carbohydrate on the planet in order to sleep through the night. But with superstarch, he was. So at age 9, for the very first time in his life, he was able to take the equivalent of 2 servings of superstarch or 2 servings of UCAN and sleep 8 hours straight through the night. And that was the first piece of validation, or one of the first big pieces of validation, saying that this truly is something different. It's something that the world doesn't have right now. It is an extraordinarily complex carbohydrate that releases energy in a very, very long, steady fashion, unlike basically every other carbohydrate out there, to the point where Jonah can actually sleep through the night. So a little quick fact on Jonah: he actually just graduated high school, and he's off to Colgate University. He was captain of his baseball team and hockey teams, and he's doing great. So he comes by the office all the time to pick up his UCAN, and he's actually, I forgot what I was going to say. Whatever. We'll finish up the story. So the next piece of the story there was that they approached Bob and they said, hey, is this of interest to endurance athletes with this long-lasting, steady energy? So now we'll go back and look at some of the science and how it leads into the case study, which is me, and how UCAN and metabolic efficiency training really helped me with GI distress in my case and performance. So what does the science say here? On the slide, you'll see on the chart on the left, glucose concentration. To be very layman's terms about this, what you see in the blue line is a spike in a crash profile from maltodextrin that Bob was describing. The red line is superstarch, and you'll see there's a swell of energy that lasts over a long period of time. The green line for reference is your control, and that's water. So you see over time, it just gradually goes down. There's no influx of energy, essentially, and it's not an ideal situation if you're out there for any length of time. So what you see with the blue line with that spike and crash is that after about 30 or 45 minutes or so, you tend to be kind of not feeling great because you're down the backside of that slope. And that's why they recommend on the back of your goo packets and gel packets and your sports nutrition drinks that are sugary or maltodextrin based, they will tell you to continually dose with your sugary sports drink or take a gel every 20 to 30 minutes. But that is not the case with superstarch. You can dose much less frequently, and it's going to give you a much longer energy profile. The other piece here is that because blood glucose, and Bob has talked about this on several occasions now, how when blood glucose rises like that and you have a spike, it also spikes your insulin levels. And so in that chart on the right-hand side, you see that dotted line with that spike, like almost a pyramid there. Now that's maltodextrin being consumed before a cycling bout. And it spikes your insulin levels. And then because your insulin levels spike, it diminishes your body's ability to burn fat and tap into those fat stores. And the solid dark line here is superstarch. And you see with superstarch that it's almost nearly muted. There's almost no insulin response whatsoever. And what that allows you to do is tap into your fat stores better, which is on this next slide. So you see these are from several different studies, actually. We have some validation from these studies showing that there's better fat oxidation, more stable blood sugar. And what you see in that chart, fat oxidation, is that superstarch, the red line, is improved fat oxidation over maltodextrin. Maltodextrin is what underlies most of your sports nutrition. And if it's not maltodextrin, it's simple sugars, which are fructose and glucose. And those are even more simple than maltodextrin. Maltodextrin for a long time has been considered complex. So the main findings here are that blood sugar is far more stable than maltodextrin, and insulin remains nearly muted with superstarch. Fat oxidation is improved. The molecular weight, as Bob mentioned earlier, is very, very high, and you can see that in the chart below there. I'm a numbers guy. I love this stuff. And osmolality is very, very low, and osmolality is inversely proportional, inversely related to molecular weight. And osmolality, as Bob was mentioning before, it means that it clears your stomach very, very quickly. So because it clears the stomach so quickly, it stops you from having GI distress, which is that sloshing and bloating and stomach aches and diarrhea and all sorts of awful things that could happen, especially when you're running, and especially in the heat. There's all sorts of things that exacerbate that. Now, there's still a lot we don't know about superstarch because it is so new, but so far this is what we know and what we've seen in the studies and in the anecdotes. You could see the numbers illustrated down there with the molecular weight and the osmolality. And what I mentioned before about this epic molecule with superstarch, it's around 600,000 molecular weight relative to maltodextrin, which has been considered complex in the past. It's only 500 to 3,000. It's minuscule compared to superstarch. And then onto my own case study. So I started triathlon back in 2010. And before that, I was a runner. And then in 2011, I did my first half Ironman event. And I did 2 more that year. And I noticed that as I went longer in distance, I got better relative to the competition. So I kept going longer and longer. And in 2012, I did my first Ironman event at Lake Placid. And then the next year, I did 3 more Ironman events. I did Placid, Louisville, and Kona. And I performed in all 4 of those events. I performed fairly well, but my performance is being held back by nutrition. And it's because by the end of the bike or somewhere on the run, I'd be having GI distress. All my friends were telling me, okay, use this rule of thumb. You take your body weight in pounds, you double it, and that's how many calories an hour you should be taking. So I'm like, okay, about 150 times 2. It's like, okay, 300 calories an hour. And you name it, I tried it. Every sports nutrition product out there. I mean, you're talking Gatorade Endurance, GU, like Cliff, Ironman Perform, EFS, CarboPro. I mean, pretty much everything. I went through all of them trying to figure something out that would be different. But really, they're all based in the same carbohydrates, these simple sugars and maltodextrin. And so they were all giving me the same result. And as you can see this picture here, stomach aches, GI distress all over the place. So it was affecting my performances because the GI distress itself was affecting it. But then it was also the fact that once I had that GI distress and I was nauseated by looking at that next gel or the next bottle of sugary sports drink, then I couldn't do it anymore. I'd stop consuming fuel. And if you do that when you're exercising and you've got more than, half hour, 2 hours, 3 hours to go, you're in trouble. And so 45 minutes later, I'm bonking and I have no energy left, and I'm joining the Ironman Death March. And so I did that several times in 2013, and finally was like, all right, I'm done with this. I needed to get this nailed down because it's affecting my performances pretty big. And so in 2014, I reached out to a sports nutritionist, one that is a disciple of Bob Seebohar's, taught me metabolic efficiency training and made those tweaks. And I say tweaks in my diet because it's not an overhaul for most people. At least it wasn't for me, because it's not extreme. Like Bob showed in that chart, it's tweaks, it's shifts in your approach. And I made these tweaks under Nikki's guidance. And then she also introduced me to UCAN, which at the time I'd never heard of before. And I trusted her. So I went out and I bought some UCAN, started using it in my training. I noticed that steady, long-lasting energy. And then I started having, no GI distress issues on my longer workouts. And I started looking forward to my next bottle of UCAN rather than dreading my 5th bottle of sugary sports drink on my long training rides. But the true test was going to really be in a full Ironman. So it was at Ironman Maryland in 2014, where I put it to the test. And I've used UCAN for the first time ever. And for the first time ever in an Ironman, I had a huge breakthrough from a nutritional standpoint. Between metabolic efficiency training and UCAN, I was able to consume far fewer calories than usual. I finally had no GI distress. And for the very first time in an Ironman, that was like mind blowing to me. And I had no bonking issues whatsoever with any low energy or anything. And I ran 20 minutes faster off the bike than I ever had. I ran a 3 flat marathon because I was actually able to run strong the whole time. I had a 51-minute PR overall, and I ended up winning the entire race. So this was Ironman Maryland 2014. So I absolutely blew away all expectations that I had. And this was like my mind-blowing epiphany moment that, wow, fat adaptation through something like metabolic efficiency training, it works. And UCAN, it works. I was like, why isn't everybody already doing this? And I still to this day don't quite know the reason, because I think it's just because people aren't well versed in it and educated enough to know that it makes such a big difference, especially for people who have had GI distress before. It's almost like a silver bullet, and there's not many silver bullets that exist out there. I want to hop back actually real quick to a slide about the metabolic efficiency training experience that I had. When I first started working with Nikki, she had me test before we made any diet changes. And you'll see in the more faint line in the background, that was my first test, metabolic efficiency test on a treadmill. And I was running at these various paces, going up from 11-minute pace up to 5:46 pace. And you can see the 2 substrates or 2 fuel sources that you use as an athlete are fat and carbohydrates, almost exclusively between those 2. And you can see at 6:44 pace, which is my target Ironman pace, I was burning 60% carbohydrate and 40%, actually 38% fat. And then you'll see 5 weeks later, after making those tweaks to my diet, after 5 weeks, the darker lines that you see, the orange where the green is circling it, is the test that I took the second time on the treadmill. Same test, everything, the conditions and everything were the same. It was just 5 weeks of metabolic efficiency training. And you can see I was burning 60% fat and 40% carbohydrate at the same race pace. So for me, that was a huge shift. It means that my dependence on those glycogen stores or those carbohydrate stores was way reduced. And my ability to burn fat was increased markedly. And it was shown in the numbers. And I noticed it in my training, and I noticed that I was feeling different, but seeing it in the numbers was really remarkable.
And Matt, can I add something to that?
Please.
You can kind of see those 2 crosses, right? We call that the metabolic efficiency point, where you see the faint yellow and the faint gray versus the darker orange and the darker gray. You increased your pace at your metabolic efficiency point at a pace of 45 seconds faster in 5 weeks. I mean, that's impressive right there.
Yeah.
So which means you were burning more fat at higher intensities. And that's one misnomer that a lot of people say is, oh, you can't burn fat at high intensities. Well, you're proving it. We proved it with thousands of athletes around the country and world, that you proved that you can actually change your body's adaptability to burn fat at higher intensities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in here, I was burning more fat than carbohydrate at 6:25 pace, which is faster than my Ironman pace for sure.
Yep.
Yeah. Now I'm just going to go quickly over a couple of implementation strategies with UCAN specifically before we open it up to some questions. So first, I want to just highlight this: 1 serving equals 1 scoop equals 1 packet equals 1 hour. Really, really easy to remember. But if you look on the UCAN site, you'll see that 1 serving is 1 scoop from the tubs, and 1 scoop is going to last you about 1 hour. So it's a rule of thumb, guideline here. Everybody is different, and as Bob mentioned, everybody's got different shapes, sizes, ability to burn fat, age, gender, all these different things, genetics, they all play into your needs, your own needs. And so that applies with any sports nutrition. You need to test and dial it in during your training, use it during your training to figure out exactly what your needs are. So that way, come race day, whenever these races start up again, then you'll be ready with your race plan. Now's a perfect time to be experimenting. So if you see that that's not enough for you, then you can just scale that up towards, let's say, 1 serving every 45 minutes, or maybe it's 1.5 servings every hour, or maybe it's even 2 servings every hour. If you're a very, you have a very high metabolic rate, maybe you just have really big demands, and maybe you're competing at a very, very sort of high percentage of your FTP, or like a more pointy end athlete, then you might require some more fuel than somebody else might require. I think that's the only thing I'm going to highlight right now, just for the sake of time, because I do want to leave time for questions. And I'll skip over to this slide here. So some ways that you can incorporate UCAN into your daily life too. One thing to mention here is that UCAN is something that you can actually use for daily energy support. It's a sports nutrition, well, a nutrition that can be used in sport and in daily life. Most sports nutrition products, like a gel, you wouldn't just take a gel at 3 p.m. because you're feeling low. You wouldn't, suck down some sugary sports drink that you have because you're not feeling so great at 11 p.m. or 11 a.m. before lunch comes. But you can do that with UCAN. So here are some options on this slide, and we'll send around the slides afterwards too, so you can take a look at these, or maybe incorporate some of these other ways. I'm going to go right to this last slide and kick it over to you, Bob, quickly, if you have anything to add on the slides that we just showed, and then we'll open it up to questions. So make sure everybody, you're putting your questions into the chat so we can address those. The other thing too, actually, because we have a relatively small group, we'll if you turn on your videos and you turn on, and then you can unmute yourself, or I can unmute you, and then you can actually ask it in person if you want.
Yeah, just to highlight what you said on the previous slide, Matt, I actually have a lot of the athletes I work with, recreational endurance athletes. We all would get through, because of dysregulated blood sugar, improper balancing, that afternoon time is just a bear for most of us. 2 to 4 p.m., 2 to 5 p.m. I actually recommend, honestly, a serving, like UCAN is nutrition. It's not a supplement. I don't know if I can't remember if you mentioned that or not, but it's a nutrition product. So it actually fits really well when your blood sugar is tanking in the afternoon, when you think you need sugar or you need caffeine. I love introducing either a UCAN bar or just 1 scoop of UCAN with a little bit of water, just to get over that hump to make it to dinner, or if you have like a later day workout. So it's a great way to utilize UCAN that just makes sense to me, because usually we don't want to eat a lot before dinner or even before a workout. So UCAN is like the go-to for my afternoon for sure.
Yeah, the bars are delicious.
Yeah.
And we just launched a couple new bars in April, the chocolate almond butter and salted peanut butter bars, and both of them are just awesome. The chocolate peanut butter bar is one of our top sellers store-wide. So those are fantastic snacks in the afternoons.
They're amazing. They're not fantastic, man. They are literally amazing. You want to eat like a whole box when you eat. Yeah, it's amazing.
I just stop myself. My kids love them too. They go nuts over them.
Yeah.
I have to, sometimes I'll just see like an empty UCAN bar wrapper on the floor somewhere in my house. I'm like, what? They got into the pantry and they stole my bars.
Yeah.
Like 2 and 3 years old. We're also raffling off. I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but it was in the announcements and the emails and things that you all received in order to sign up for this event. But we are raffling off an essential nutrition UCAN bundle, which is worth, I think, something like $180 worth of UCAN products. So we'll raffle that off shortly. For anybody who is attending live, you have to attend live in order to be eligible. So you have a pretty good shot of winning it. So far, I'm not seeing any questions. So please throw your questions in there. And this could be for Bob. It could be for me. It could be related to UCAN or metabolic efficiency training, or just really it could be any training or nutrition questions that you have at all. So please chime in and take advantage of Bob's knowledge. And then I'll give it a couple minutes and we can raffle it off too. So you know what, I'll even tell everybody what the Essential Nutrition Bundle looks like. Put the link in here. What part of Colorado is Bob in?
Oh, I am in Littleton, southwest of downtown Denver, about 35 to 45 minutes southwest of downtown Denver. And my testing facility, Energy Performance, is actually in Lakewood. So it's, if you know Colorado, it's right by I-70 and C-470 interchange by Green Mountain. So that's where I do all my metabolic efficiency testing and biomarker testing.
I got to come out and visit sometime, Bob.
Absolutely. Well, not right now. We have a few fires burning, if you haven't heard, so it's a little bit smoky.
Looks like we have another question. So Bob, have you ever worked with someone using UCAN that has leptin resistance?
Oh, I have not actually. That would actually be very interesting. I mean, easy answer is no. I can't even relate and formulate a topic or an answer to that other than no. I have not had that in all my years. Never had someone with that.
I just typed in a link to the Essential Nutrition Bundle on our site so you can see what it is that's in there. We're going to be raffling that off in just a moment. And then I also typed in a link to, it looks like didn't really turn it into a link, but you can type that into, or copy and paste that into your browser. That will auto-populate the CAUSE25 code, or you could just use this at checkout, CAUSE25, and you'll get 25% off your first order. If you have already ordered UCAN, then CAUSE events is the code that you can use for 15% off on all future orders. So I'm going to raffle this off right now with my random generator here. And Jennifer Hine, looks like Jennifer Hine is the winner. Congratulations. So Jennifer, if you can.
Cheering.
Yeah, right. I miss the in-person events.
I know.
I mean, this works, but you know, it's just great to be in person with people. You can actually feel the crowd and see the crowd,
Exactly.
and it's see the smiles on people's faces.
Exactly.
Okay, so Jennifer Hine, I'm going to put my email address in here. Actually, you know what? I think it is on the slide already. So, yep, it's right there. So make sure you email me at that email address, and send me your mailing address and send me the options that you would like, the flavor options. So the Essential Nutrition Bundle is the one that I pasted in there, that link.
Incredible.
So make sure you select the different flavors that you want, send them to me by email, and I'll fulfill that. Also, let me know whether you are familiar with UCAN or not, because I can help you decide on the different flavors, and I can help you understand more about your specific questions, like, you know, help you with, and this actually goes to everybody in the group. If you have specific questions about how to fuel an upcoming brick workout or an upcoming long run or whatever it is, then you can always shoot me a note. You can shoot Bob a note and ask, hey, how would you go about doing this? I also included Bob's email address on here. He kindly allowed us to have this in the slides so that you can ask any questions that you might have after the fact, whether they be, you know, one-on-one, you know, better suited to one-on-one type of questions, or whether they're just questions that you think of later. And one thing that I definitely want to mention while we're waiting for any more questions that are going to come in, a huge thank you to Carrie and to Tobias, because without CAUSE events, we wouldn't have this event. We wouldn't have Bob Seebohar on here sharing his infinite wisdom. So thank you so much for putting this event together and inviting your audience, inviting the CAUSE community into this. CAUSE events, I mean, you're all on their mailing list, like you had to be here, but so you know who CAUSE events are. But Carrie and Tobias are some of the two most passionate people I've ever met in the triathlon and running world. They love what they do, and as you might imagine, I'm sure they're going through a pretty tough time right now, not being able to host the events that they love and that they do as the living. So they're just fantastic people, and hopefully these events will be back up and running sometime soon so that we can all get out there and race and, you know, do some amazing things and fun things together. Give it a couple more minutes here while we've got 2 more minutes of Bob's time for anybody who has questions. So feel free to throw one in there right now. Otherwise, do you have any while we're waiting for any questions that come in, do you have any parting thoughts for us, Bob? Anything that I didn't cover, or?
Yeah, I don't think we really chatted about the hydrate at all.
Yeah, we didn't.
I just see the canister up there, and that's actually one of my favorite products. It's, you know, I think I alluded to when I was talking about super starch, and almost every product has super starch. Well, this is one of the products that doesn't have a super starch in it, because it is basically just electrolyte powder that's formulated based on science and based on what the body sweats out and kind of what it needs. But it's a phenomenal powder, not only to use while training, but if you just need like some flavor in your water throughout the day, it's a great way to get a few electrolytes, and it is very balanced. Not balance, but it's very methodical in the sodium and chloride and the potassium, magnesium, calcium content in there. So we actually help to formulate that with UCAN.
Yeah, thanks to Bob's help that we have that formulation. It tastes amazing. It's so good. Like I love it when I throw a few ice cubes in my UCAN shaker bottle, which is this guy tucked in behind the bars there. I've got, obviously a few of those at home, and I throw some of the ice cubes in there and a couple scoops of the UCAN hydrate. I love the watermelon. And shake that up, get it nice and cold. And that is like absolute magic after my workouts.
Completely. Yep. Watermelon's on the top of my list too.
So one question we have is, can you go over how to carb unload again?
Yeah. So you don't have to be too methodical. Like what I normally recommend is take it as, so carbohydrate unloading is taking 4 weeks to unload your daily carbohydrate intake. So if you're, again, I gave the easy example. If you're having like 2 bagels at breakfast, maybe 2 peanut butter bagels at breakfast, next week you would have 1 peanut butter bagel and maybe put an egg in there for a little bit of protein, a little bit of fat. And then the next week you have half a bagel. And then the next week you have maybe like Greek yogurt and berries. So all you're trying to do is step down. It's not going low carb. It's actually getting carbohydrates to where you can optimally balance your blood sugar instead of spiking your blood sugar. So I would argue, remember, if you keep the ratio, the hand model, and you keep that 1-to-1 in mind, even the 2-to-1 in mind, you want to get at week 4, you want to get to a 1-to-1 or a 2-to-1 ratio. That's your whole goal over 4 weeks. Some athletes can do it in 2, some athletes can do it in 3. It kind of depends on how much of a carbivore you actually are to start with, based on how much time you need to step it down. So the whole concept is get to 2-to-1 or 1-to-1 by the end, which could be week 3 or week 4, maybe week 2. But take your time doing it. Don't pull the trigger. Trust me, it's not worth the pain that you will feel. And pain meaning you're gonna have just this horrible feeling overall, like you have no energy and you have a foggy brain. So that's why I created the unloading protocol, so you don't have to just pull the trigger and all of a sudden feel lousy for a week. So just take your time over 2 to 4 weeks.
Right, hopefully that answered the question. And if you have any further questions, let us know. We can answer them now before we log off, or email Bob, and he can certainly help answer those questions too.
Happy to.
You could follow us on Instagram and on Facebook. Those are the 3 different handles there, which you probably see here up on the slide. And join the mailing list. I think Bob and UCAN both have mailing lists. Bob's company is Energy Performance. All right. Well, I think unless there's any more last minute question that somebody's going to toss in there, I hope you all walking away from this finding some really interesting information, maybe tweak some of your dinner that you're going to be having very shortly. And, hopefully you'll pick up some UCAN too. But if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to either one of us. Thanks again to Carrie and Tobias at Cause Events for putting this event together. And we'll hopefully see you at the races sometime soon. Thank you all for taking a little time out of your evening to join us. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks, everyone.